Hello, it's Coach Blades, and today we will be looking at Chapter 13, Gothic Europe. Some key ideas from this chapter. We'll see a lot of the same architectural concepts from the Romanesque period carry into the Gothic period, including rib vaults, pointed arches, and the bay system for creating distinct sections in churches. The invention of the flying buttress, a support system that works on the outside of the church building, allows churches to reach new heights. And portal sculpture on the doorways to churches becomes more three-dimensional, with the sculpture standing out in high relief from the walls, as well as elongated figures to match the columns, and again, the emphasis on verticality and height in these buildings. We'll continue to look at manuscript painting, and they become more luminous, probably to match the beautiful light that comes through the stained glass windows, and stylistically they have a lot of similarities. Moving on to the required works, we'll start with Saint Denis, the very first cathedral to show Gothic architecture. We'll then move on to Chartres Cathedral and look at several different parts of it, including a portal entrance and the famous window. Then we'll look at an illuminated manuscript featuring the Blanche of Castile and King Louis IX of France, followed by another church, Sainte-Chapelle, and last, a sculpture from the Holy Roman Empire called the Racine Pieta. Here are the required vocabulary terms that we'll use to discuss these artworks. First, we'll look at Saint Denis, and it is important because it was the first building to incorporate Gothic architecture. Abbot Suger, the patron, wanted light filtered by stained glass to saturate the inside of the building. This awe-inspiring light was called lux nova. As you can see here in the ambulatory, the space is a little less compartmentalized compared to the Romanesque period. The rib vaults start at the ceiling and go down as far as the capitals of the columns. The columns are rounded and unarticulated, and the pointed arches give height to this small space. This allows the chapels to flow from one to the other and minimizes the effect of mass and weight on the interior, again giving a light and airy feeling. This location is also important because it's the burial site for French royalty in the crypt below. Next, we have Chartres Cathedral. We'll spend a lot of time on this one looking at lots of aspects of the church. Remember, a cathedral isn't just a church because it's also the chair for a bishop. Let's talk about the context of this church. Legend says that the church was built on the site of a Druidic temple. We don't know if that is true, but we do know it was built on the site of a Roman temple, which we have seen Roman areas repurposed for Christian spaces throughout this course. It has a long history of use as a Christian space and was used for worship and Christianity all the way back to 200 CE. Chartres has always been associated with the worship of the Virgin Mary and even had cult followings for Virgin Mary there. One reason for this association is that the church received a relic from Constantinople, the tunic of Mary. This relic made the church hugely popular for pilgrimages and also made the church very rich. At one point in 1194, the church burned down, but the tunic was found 3 days later unharmed. The people took this miracle as a divine message that they should rebuild the church so that it would be as grand and as beautiful as possible, deserving to be the place of worship of Mary. Because of this fire, we can see parts that survived the fire that had Romanesque style, some early Gothic, and even some high Gothic trends in different parts of the church. It's neat that we can see all those different time periods in one place. As I mentioned before, Chartres was a hugely popular pilgrimage site, and it needed to be bigger and more impressive to accommodate all those pilgrims. Chartres is one of the first places to use flying buttresses, which allowed the building to get even taller than ever before. You can see the buttresses on the outside of the church. They are diagonal poles, basically, that help the church withstand wind even at these tall heights. It also allowed for more window space because it moved the buttressing system outside of the walls of the church. Looking on the inside, you can see just how tall and open the interior feels. The formal plan of the church is again a Latin cross with 3 aisles a short transept, and an ambulatory. It includes a 3-part elevation of a nave arcade, a triforium, and clerestory. The architects left out a gallery, which usually would have been present as part of a 4-part elevation, and this is because they wanted to increase the amount of space for stained glass windows. They also used pointed arches and rib vaults inside the body of the church, which was meant to draw the eye upward. When looking at the ceiling over the nave in the picture on the right, you can see the quadripartite bays, meaning the diagonal ribs divide the ceiling into 4 parts of each bay. It has 9 portal entrances, and we're going to look at the great portal of the west facade. It's one of the earliest because it was not destroyed in the fire of 1194. This portal is important because it's only used during special ceremonies and not ever used by the public. In the center tympanum, we see Christ enthroned and surrounded by 4 evangelist symbols. He sits in a cloud supported by angels. Apostles sit in the lintel, organized into 3 groups of 4. 24 elders of the apocalypse line the archivolts. And notice that everything is a little bit more deeply carved and 3-dimensional than the Romanesque style. In the right portal, we see the Incarnation, or God's first earthly appearance, as well as a focus on Mary's role in the life of Christ. In the center, Christ sits on Mary's lap, otherwise known as the throne of wisdom. In the lintel, it shows Christ in a temple and also a nativity scene. Women below represent the 7 liberal arts. Men, including a portrait of Aristotle, are seen as writers. Archivolts show human labors and embody learning possibilities which would have been available through the church school. In the left portal, we see the Ascension scene, or God's return to heaven from earth. Some scholars also think it could be the creation at the beginning of time, and this is still debated. We also have a picture of Christ and 6 angels in the tympanum, and a row of figures below stare upward at him. Underneath the 3 tympanums are jamb sculptures on the sides of the doorways. These feature Old Testament kings, queens, and prophets, and it's supposed to stand as a metaphor of the Old Testament below supporting the New Testament above. This is also why it's given the name Royal Portal. The figures are elongated, linear, and still lifelike and individualized, and their verticality again adds to the orderly feel of the portal. Next, we will look at the Notre Dame de la Belle Bière. This window is one of the most famous windows at Chartres, and remember, there was a huge Gothic emphasis on stained glass. The large windows were made possible by the use of flying buttresses, and the goal was to create floating planes of light. The windows were meant to make people feel completely surrounded by light and inundated by the spiritual presence. Light was seen as a divine symbol because it was beautiful and immaterial, so people saw it as the closest thing that they could get to the divine realm. In a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, it makes sense that the large window would have her portrait, and the name translates to Our Lady of the Beautiful. In the center, we see Mary holding Christ on a throne. She's beautiful, young, and wearing a crown, making her the Queen of Heaven. She has a large halo behind her, and she's also accompanied above by a dove, which is supposed to represent the Holy Spirit. Now we will look at an illuminated manuscript page called the Dedication page with Blanche of Castile and King Louis IX of France. You'll start to see some similarities between the style of the illuminated manuscript and the stained glass. They definitely influenced each other. You can see that the page is more luminous because it is filled with reflective gold. It has black outlines, which was similar to how stained glass had black lead outlines around each panel of colored glass. There's also minimal modeling or shading and a restricted use of color, which is similar to how stained glass has to use one color at a time. This page comes from the front of a Moralized Bible, which was a Bible that included explanations and paired illustrations for each story. At the top, we see the Queen Mother, Blanche of Castile, who was regent ruler to her son, King Louis X, who's seen as a teenager, until he came of age. She instructs her son, but he is still superior. She looks like many depictions as the Virgin as queen, He looks similar to Christ, and this pairing and similarity is not done by mistake. They sit on elaborate thrones. They have slightly oversized heads with very big crowns. There's lots of gold. The architecture is also pretty ornate surrounding them. And King Louis holds a scepter and a brooch with a sapphire, showing him as the future ruler. At the bottom, we see a monk dictating to a scribe, and it looks like he's working on a page for this very book because it already has the divisions drawn on. Now we will look at the Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which was the epitome of Gothic style in the Rayonnant period. You can see that there's hardly any walls, and 75% of the walls are actually made up of windows. The columns are also very slender, and the windows just look like sheets of colored glass that allow the entire chapel to be filled with light. This building was built specifically to house sacred artifacts collected by Louis IX, including the original Christ's crown of thorns. King Louis also created a special ceremony or day for this relic, where he would carry the crown of thorns through the procession. The building itself is supposed to represent a giant reliquary. The building adjoins to the royal palace, and it allowed the public to come into what felt like a very royal space and felt very special. The public would buy indulgences both for past and future sins on these special days. King Louis intended this building to be a symbol of his authority and his divine right to rule. Analogies can again be drawn from the numerous visual representations of Christ as king and Mary as queen to the monarch's divine rights to rule. Overall, there are over 1,000 scenes depicted in the stained glass windows, telling biblical stories all the way from Genesis to Christ's crucifixion. For our final work, we will look at the Rotgen Pieta. Rotgen is the name of the collector, and Pieta is an Italian word for pity or compassion, and always features a scene of Mary holding the dead body of Jesus Christ. This sculpture comes from the Holy Roman Empire and focuses way more on the emotional impact of the scene. We call this an ontox builder, or a devotional image used to assist in prayer and contemplation. The goal was to make the biblical figures more human and show the suffering of Jesus and the grief of his mother. We see Christ's body stiffened in death. He's covered in blood, which still gushes from all of his wounds. He looks emaciated and his head tilts back at an unnatural angle. Mary's face is anguished and shows a twisted expression of grief, horror, and shock. The goal of this sculpture was to encourage empathy in the viewer. Famous monks such as St. Francis of Assisi stress Christ's humanity and poverty, and this trend caught on. We wanted to focus on those qualities rather than the divinity of Christ.